The first gunshot echoed across the plains like a thunderclap, sending a flock of startled birds into the crimson-streaked sky. Willow Blackburn didn't flinch as the bullet struck the wooden post just inches from her head, her emerald eyes steady as stone as she stared down the barrel of her Winchester rifle. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory had no patience for weakness, especially not from a woman alone. "You missed," she called out, her voice carrying across the stretch of dry grass separating her homestead from the three riders approaching. "Next time, I won't." Willow's finger rested on the trigger, her breathing controlled despite the fear twisting in her gut. 6 months since Frank's death, and still the vultures circled, waiting to claim what they believed should never have belonged to a woman. "Mrs. Blackburn," the lead rider called out, tipping his hat in mock respect. "We ain't looking for trouble, just delivering a message from Mr. Sullivan." "Your boss already delivered his message," Willow responded, rifle unwavering. "My answer remains the same. This land is mine, fair and legal." The three men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. The leader, a weasel-faced man named Hobbs, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Lady, you're swimming against the current. No woman can run a cattle ranch alone. Be reasonable." "I'm being perfectly reasonable," Willow replied. "Now get off my property before I decide my hospitality has run its course." The tension stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Finally, Hobbs yanked his horse around. "Sullivan won't take kindly to this. There are worse things than selling, Mrs. Blackburn." "I'll keep that in mind," she said flatly, watching as they retreated toward the horizon. Only when they disappeared from sight did Willow lower her rifle, letting out a shaking breath. The weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like an anvil. Frank had left her with land, cattle, and a mountain of debt that grew steeper with each passing day. Sullivan, the banker who held most of those debts, was running out of patience and decency. Willow returned to the half-finished fence she'd been working on since sunrise. Her hands were blistered and raw, unaccustomed to the rough work despite the months she'd been doing it. The cattle needed containing before winter set in. Everything needed doing, and there was only her to do it. As dusk approached, Willow trudged back to the modest cabin she'd shared with Frank. 3 years of marriage cut short by a stray bullet in a saloon argument that hadn't even involved him. Just wrong place, wrong moment, and her world had collapsed like a house of cards. She lit the lamp and stared at the meager stew bubbling over the fire. The silence of the cabin pressed in around her, suffocating in its completeness. Even with Frank gone half a year, sometimes she could swear she heard his voice, a low chuckle when she dropped something, a whispered reassurance when she stared too long at the ledger of mounting debts. "I must be losing my mind," she murmured, serving herself a bowl of the bland stew. A sharp knock at the door made her jump, spilling hot broth onto her hand. Cursing under her breath, Willow grabbed her pistol from the table and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called, voice steady despite her racing heart. "Xavier Thornton, madam." "I heard you might be looking for ranch help." Willow frowned. She couldn't afford help, though God knew she needed it. "Who told you that?" she asked through the door. "Old Pete at the general store mentioned you were running the place alone. I'm looking for work, and I'm good with cattle." Willow hesitated, then cracked open the door, keeping her pistol visible. The man standing on her porch was tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of years under the sun. His eyes were a startling blue against his tanned face, and a well-worn Stetson sat atop dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. He looked to be in his early 30s, with the calm demeanor of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I can't pay much," Willow said bluntly. "Barely keeping this place afloat as it is," Xavier nodded. "I understand. I'm not asking for much, just meals and a place to sleep, maybe a small wage when you can manage it." "Why would you work for so little?" A shadow passed over his face. "Let's just say I'm looking for somewhere quiet to stay for a while." Alarm bells rang in Willow's mind. "You running from the law, Mr. Thornton?" "No, madam," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Not the law, just looking for a fresh start." Willow studied him for a long moment. Her instincts, usually reliable, didn't signal danger, and she was desperate. The cattle needed moving to winter pasture soon, and she couldn't manage alone. "You can sleep in the barn," she finally said. "First sign of trouble and you're gone, understood?" "Understood," he replied with a slight nod. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Willow said dryly. "You haven't seen what needs doing." The next morning arrived with a bitter chill that promised an early winter. Willow rose before dawn, as had become her habit, and was startled to find smoke already rising from the cookstove and coffee brewing. Xavier stood by the stove, frying bacon in her cast iron pan. "Hope you don't mind," he said, glancing up as she entered. "Figured you could use a hot breakfast before we get started." Willow blinked in surprise. "You cook?" "7 years with a cattle outfit teaches a man a thing or two," he replied with a slight shrug. "Nothing fancy, but it's edible." The bacon smelled heavenly, and Willow's stomach growled traitorously. She'd been subsisting on whatever was quick and easy, oftentimes just bread and jerky after exhausting days of work. "I've already fed the horses," Xavier continued. "Noticed your bay mare has a loose shoe." "I can fix that today if you've got the tools." Willow sat at the table, feeling slightly off balance. "You've been busy." "Early riser," he explained, sliding a plate of bacon and eggs in front of her. "Habit from trail drives." The food was simple but delicious, and Willow found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in months. Xavier ate quickly and efficiently, asking practical questions about the ranch between bites. "How many head of cattle are we talking?" "About 200, Willow replied. "Not a large operation, but it was growing before." She stopped, then continued more steadily, "before my husband died." Xavier nodded, not pressing for details. 200 is enough to turn a profit if managed right. Where's your winter pasture?" "South Valley, near the creek." "It's about 5 miles from here. We should start moving them by the end of the week. That storm front coming in looks like it means business." Willow raised an eyebrow. "You can tell that just by looking at the sky." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Been riding these plains since I was 16. You learn to read the weather or you don't survive long." After breakfast, they set to work repairing the fence Willow had started. Xavier worked methodically, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done hard labor all his life. By midday, they'd accomplished what would have taken Willow 3 days on her own. As they worked side by side, Willow found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. There was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he carried a heavy burden. His hands were calloused and scarred, telling stories of a life lived rough. But his eyes were kind when they met hers, and he treated her with a respect that had become rare since Frank's death. "You're not from around here," she observed as they paused for water. Xavier shook his head. "Came up from Texas about a month ago. Long way from home." "Home is a flexible concept in my experience," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Never stayed in one place too long. And yet you're looking for a permanent position." His eyes met hers, searching. "Maybe it's time to see what staying put feels like." Something in his tone made Willow look away, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy of the moment. "Well, there's plenty to do if you're serious about staying. The north fence is completely down, the barn roof leaks something terrible, and the cattle need to be counted and moved before the snow flies." Xavier nodded, accepting the change in subject. "Let's finish this section, then tackle the barn roof. Rain's coming tonight." He was right. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the air grew heavy with impending rain. They worked until the first fat droplets began to fall, then hurried to shelter in the barn. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against the newly patched roof. Inside, it was dry but cold. Xavier lit a lantern and hung it from a hook, casting warm light over the interior. "You did good work," Willow admitted, looking up at the roof. "Not a single leak." "For now," he replied. "Come spring, we should replace the whole thing. This is just a temporary fix." The casual way he spoke of spring, as if his presence here months from now was a foregone conclusion, both unsettled and comforted Willow. She hadn't planned beyond the next day since Frank died, the future too uncertain to contemplate. "You're assuming a lot," she said quietly. Xavier looked at her, his expression unreadable in the lantern's flickering light. "I suppose I am, But I'm a man who believes in being prepared, Mrs. Blackburn. Willow, she corrected automatically. If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my name. Willow, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her heart skip unexpectedly. And I'm Xavier, never much cared for formalities. The rain continued to fall as they sat in companionable silence, the steady drumming on the roof creating a cocoon of isolation from the world beyond. For the first time in months, Willow felt the crushing weight of responsibility lighten, if only momentarily. In the days that followed, they fell into an efficient rhythm. Xavier proved to be everything he'd claimed: skilled with cattle, knowledgeable about the land, and a tireless worker. Under his care, the ranch began to show signs of recovery from the months of neglect Willow hadn't been able to prevent. They began moving the cattle to the winter pasture, a task that would have been impossible for Willow alone. Xavier seemed to have an almost supernatural connection with the animals, guiding them with quiet commands and subtle movements of his horse. "Where did you learn to work cattle like that?" Willow asked one evening as they returned from a long day in the saddle. "My father was a rancher," Xavier replied, his expression distant. "Had a small spread near San Antonio, taught me everything I know about cattle before he died." "I'm sorry," Willow said softly. "How old were you?" 15, too young to run the ranch, too old to be taken in easily. "Ended up riding with different outfits, learning what I could." "And your mother," a shadow passed over his face. "Died when I was born, never knew her," Willow nodded, understanding loss in a way few others could. "Frank, my husband, he used to say we make our own families in this life. That blood isn't what matters most." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was," Willow said, throat tightening unexpectedly. "Not perfect, but wise in his way." That night, as wind howled around the cabin and rain lashed the windows, Willow lay awake listening to the sounds of the storm. The house creaked and groaned in protest, and somewhere in the cacophony, she could have sworn she heard Frank's voice, just a whisper, barely audible above the tempest. "I still hear him sometimes," she whispered to the darkness, allowing herself the confession she'd never spoken aloud. "Like he's trying to tell me something I can't quite make out." Morning brought clear skies and a crisp autumn chill. Xavier was already working in the corral when Willow emerged from the cabin, her night of restless sleep evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, pausing in his work. Willow nodded automatically. "Fine, just didn't sleep well with the storm." Xavier studied her for a moment longer than necessary, then returned to mending the corral gate. "Thought we might ride out to check the cattle today, make sure none wandered during the storm." "Good idea," Willow agreed, grateful for the distraction. They rode in comfortable silence, the landscape stretching endlessly before them. The storm had left the world washed clean, the autumn colors vibrant against the deep blue sky. As they crested a ridge overlooking the winter pasture, Willow reined her horse to a stop, taking in the view. The cattle grazed peacefully below, dark shapes against the golden grass. Beyond them, mountains rose purple and majestic against the horizon. It was beautiful in a way that made her heart ache, this land that she and Frank had dreamed of building into something lasting. "It's worth fighting for," Xavier said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Willow glanced at him, surprised. "What makes you think I'm fighting for anything?" "A woman alone running a ranch in Montana territory. Everything about you is fighting for something." He met her gaze steadily. "Sullivan's men have been asking about you in town, making it known that they think this place is too much for you." Willow's jaw tightened. "So that's why you really came? Heard there might be easy pickings with a widow struggling to hold onto her land." Xavier's expression didn't change at her accusation. "I came because I recognized something in what Pete told me about you: determination, pride. Maybe a touch of stubbornness that reminds me of myself. And what do you get out of helping me?" He looked out over the valley, his profile stark against the sky. "Maybe I'm tired of drifting. Maybe I want to be part of building something instead of just passing through." He turned back to her. "Or maybe I just don't like seeing vultures circle someone who deserves better." Willow studied him, trying to reconcile his words with her instinctive distrust. 6 months of fighting alone had taught her caution, but something about Xavier rang true. Sullivan wants this land for the water rights, she finally said. The creek never runs dry even in the worst drought years, makes the property valuable to someone looking to expand, Xavier nodded. I figured it was something like that. Men like Sullivan don't push this hard unless there's more at stake than just a small cattle ranch. Frank took loans to expand the herd, Willow continued. We had plans to build something substantial here. Then he was killed, and Sullivan started calling in the debts immediately, knowing I couldn't pay. How much do you owe? More than I can manage by spring, Willow admitted. Unless we can get top dollar for the cattle and find some other source of income. Xavier was quiet for a moment, contemplating. There might be a way. Cattle drives to the railroad at Helena are bringing good prices, if we can get your herd there by early spring before the market floods. That's months away, Willow pointed out. Sullivan isn't that patient. Then we buy time, Xavier said simply, and we prepare. Winter's coming, and even bankers can't foreclose easily in 3 feet of snow. For the first time in months, Willow felt a flicker of hope, dangerous and fragile, but present nonetheless. You make it sound almost possible. Xavier's smile was unexpected and transformative, lighting his weathered features with a warmth that caught her off guard. Most things are possible with enough determination, Willow Blackburn. I suspect you already know that. As they rode back to the ranch, checking fences and counting cattle, Willow found herself watching Xavier. There was a confidence in the way he rode, an ease that spoke of thousands of miles in the saddle. But beneath that competence, she sensed a restlessness, as if part of him was always alert, always watching the horizon. You running from something specific, she asked abruptly, or just running in general? Xavier didn't appear surprised by the question. Bit of both, maybe. Made some enemies in Texas. Nothing criminal, he added quickly, just backed the wrong side in a range war. Man who ended up on top made it clear my continued health depended on my swift departure. And the general running, his expression grew distant. Some men aren't made for settling. Or at least, that's what I told myself for a long time. And now, Xavier looked at her, his blue eyes intense. Now I'm wondering if I just never found the right place to stop. The words hung between them, layered with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Willow looked away first, focusing on the trail ahead as they descended toward the ranch. That evening, as darkness fell and they sat before the fire in the cabin, Xavier surprised her by producing a battered harmonica from his pocket. "Do you mind?" he asked, gesturing with the instrument. Willow shook her head, curious. Xavier lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play a slow, melancholy tune that seemed to capture the vastness of the land around them. His eyes closed as he played, lost in the music. The melody wove through the cabin, filling the spaces that had been silent for too long. Willow found herself transfixed, watching his fingers move across the instrument with the same confident grace he brought to everything. When the last note faded, the silence felt different, warmer somehow, less empty. "That was beautiful," Willow said softly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Old cowhand named Jasper taught me when I was 17, Xavier replied, turning the harmonica in his hands. Said music was the best company on lonely nights. He was right, Willow agreed, suddenly aware of how comfortable this moment felt sitting with Xavier in the cabin's warm glow, the world outside held at bay by firelight and music. The realization unsettled her. Frank had been gone only 6 months, and here she was, finding comfort in another man's presence. Guilt washed over her, swift and unexpected. "I should turn in," she said abruptly, rising from her chair. "Dawn comes early." If Xavier noticed her sudden withdrawal, he didn't comment. Of course. "Sleep well, Willow." That night, Willow dreamed of Frank. He stood at the edge of their property, looking out over the land as he often had in life. "You have to let me go, Will," he said, not turning to face her. "I can't stay and you can't follow." "I don't know how to do this without you," she told him, her dream self voicing the fear she never allowed herself to express while awake. Frank finally turned, his face kind but resolute. "Yes, you do. You always have. That's why I loved you." Willow woke with tears on her cheeks and Frank's name on her lips. The dream had felt so real, his voice clearer than the whispers she sometimes thought she heard. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern hills. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Xavier already at work, splitting wood with powerful, methodical swings of the axe. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "You're up early," he observed. "Strange dreams," she replied, not elaborating. "Thought I might as well get started on the day." Xavier nodded, seemingly understanding her need for normalcy. "I was thinking we should ride into town today, get supplies before the weather turns again. Pete mentioned there's a storm coming from the north." Willow hesitated. She'd avoided town as much as possible since Frank's death, tired of the pitying looks and thinly veiled suggestions that she sell the ranch and find herself a new husband. "We do need supplies," she admitted reluctantly. "I can go alone if you prefer," Xavier offered, reading her discomfort. "No," Willow said, straightening her shoulders. "This is my ranch. I won't hide from town gossip." The ride to town took just over an hour, the trail winding through stands of aspen trees aflame with autumn color. As they approached the small settlement of Clearwater, Willow felt her shoulders tensing involuntarily. Clearwater was barely more than a wide spot in the trail: a general store, saloon, blacksmith, small church, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. Sullivan's Bank occupied the most prominent building, its fresh paint and glass windows stark against the weathered structures surrounding it. They tied their horses at the hitching post outside Pete's general store. As they entered, the bell above the door announced their arrival, causing the few customers inside to turn and stare. Pete himself, a barrel-chested man with a wild gray beard, broke into a grin at the sight of Willow. "Mrs. Blackburn, been too long since you graced us with your presence." "Hello, Pete," Willow replied with a small smile. "We need supplies, thinking winter's coming early this year." "That it is," Pete agreed, his eyes moving curiously to Xavier. "I see you took my suggestion about hiring help." "Mr. Thornton has been invaluable," Willow said formally, conscious of the listening ears around them. They gathered their supplies efficiently: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, and other necessities. Pete chatted amiably as he tallied their purchases, bringing Willow up to date on town happenings. "Sullivan's been expanding," Pete mentioned casually. "Bought out the Jenkins place last month. Poor Tom didn't stand a chance after his injury." Willow's jaw tightened. The Jenkins ranch bordered her property to the east. Sullivan was methodically acquiring all the land surrounding her. "How's Tom doing?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Moved to his sister's place in Helena," Pete replied. "Probably for the best." Man couldn't work with that crushed leg. As Pete wrapped their purchases, the store door opened and a hush fell over the room. Willow turned to see Edward Sullivan himself stepping inside, accompanied by Hobbs and another of his men. Sullivan was a tall, corpulent man with cold eyes and meticulously groomed whiskers. He dressed like an Eastern businessman, complete with gold watch chains stretching across his substantial vest. His gaze landed on Willow, and a smile that never reached his eyes spread across his face. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "What a pleasant surprise. I was beginning to think you'd become a hermit out there on that struggling ranch of yours." "Mr. Sullivan," Willow acknowledged coolly, "just getting supplies before winter." Sullivan's eyes shifted to Xavier, narrowing slightly. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Xavier Thornton," Xavier replied, his voice neutral but his stance subtly shifting to place himself between Willow and the banker. "Working for Mrs. Blackburn, are you now?" Sullivan's smile took on a predatory edge. "Interesting. I wasn't aware the Blackburn Ranch could afford to hire help given its financial situation." "My financial situation is not a matter for public discussion," Willow said evenly. "If you have concerns about my loans, we can discuss them at your bank during business hours." Sullivan chuckled, the sound entirely without humor. Of course, just expressing neighborly concern. Times are hard after all." His gaze returned to Xavier. "Though I must say, Mr. Thornton, you might want to consider your employment options carefully. I'd hate to see you work for months only to find the property sold from under you come spring." Xavier's expression remained impassive, but Willow could sense the tension in his body. "I appreciate your concern," he said mildly, "but I'm content with my current arrangement." "Well, the offer stands," Sullivan continued smoothly. "I'm always looking for good men. The pay would be substantially better than whatever arrangement you've made with Mrs. Blackburn." "We'll be going now," Willow interjected, turning back to Pete. "Thank you for the supplies." Pete handed over their packages, his expression sympathetic. "You take care, Mrs. Blackburn, weather's turning nasty." Outside, Willow took a deep breath of the cold air, trying to calm her racing heart. Xavier loaded their supplies onto the packhorses in silence. "He's pressuring everyone connected to me," Willow said quietly as they mounted their horses. "Trying to isolate me completely." "Men like Sullivan only understand power," Xavier replied, "and right now he thinks he holds all the cards." They were halfway down the main street when Hobbs emerged from the saloon, deliberately stepping into their path. Xavier reined his horse to a stop, his expression wary. "Sullivan wants a word with you, Thornton," Hobbs said, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Alone." "Any word Mr. Sullivan has for me can be said in front of Mrs. Blackburn," Xavier replied evenly. Hobbs spat into the dirt. "Suit yourself, but a smart man would listen to what the boss has to offer, especially a man with your history." Xavier stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No," Hobbs smiled unpleasantly. "Texas Rangers might disagree. Heard they're still mighty interested in what happened at the Pecos River 2 years back." Willow glanced at Xavier, whose face had gone carefully blank. "Is there a point to these insinuations, Mr. Hobbs?" she demanded. "Or are you simply blocking the public thoroughfare for entertainment?" Hobbs's smile disappeared. "Just delivering a message, madam. Some pasts don't stay buried, no matter how far north a man rides." He stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Safe travels back to your ranch." They rode in tense silence until Clearwater disappeared behind them. Finally, Willow could contain her questions no longer. What was he talking about? The Pecos River? Xavier was quiet for so long that Willow thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight. "There was a dispute over water rights. Rancher I was working for got into it with a rival outfit. Things escalated. Man ended up dead. Did you kill him?" Willow asked directly. "No," Xavier said firmly, meeting her eyes, "but I was there, witnessed it. The man who did it was the son of a state senator, so they needed someone else to blame." "And you ran." "I left," he corrected, "after making sure the Rangers had my written testimony." Not that it mattered. Money talks louder than truth in some parts. Willow considered this, weighing his words against the steadiness of his gaze. "Why tell me now?" "Because Sullivan's men will make sure everyone in town knows by nightfall, with their own embellishments added," Xavier replied grimly. "Thought you should hear it from me first. Does Sullivan really have connections to the Texas Rangers?" Xavier shook his head. "Doubtful. But he doesn't need them. Just the rumors will be enough to make folks question having me around." They rode in silence for several more minutes, each lost in thought. Finally, Willow spoke. "My husband killed a man once," she said quietly. "Before we met, bar fight gone wrong. He never ran from it, stood trial, and was acquitted on grounds of self-defense. But he always said it changed him, knowing he'd taken a life, justified or not." Xavier looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "What I'm saying," Willow continued, "is that I judge people by what I see, not by rumors or past mistakes. You've been nothing but honest and hardworking since you arrived. That counts for more with me than whatever happened on the Pecos." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a softening around the eyes, a loosening of the tight line of his mouth. "Thank you," he said simply. As they approached the ranch, the sky to the northwest had darkened ominously, confirming Pete's weather prediction. They quickened their pace, eager to secure the animals and supplies before the storm hit. They had just finished stabling the horses when the first snowflakes began to fall, large, wet flakes that quickly grew in intensity. By nightfall, the world outside had disappeared behind a curtain of swirling white, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. Willow stoked the fire higher as Xavier hung their wet coats by the stove. The storm's ferocity had caught them both by surprise too early in the season for such intensity. "Might be snowed in for a few days," Xavier observed, glancing out the frost-rimmed window where nothing was visible but darkness and driving snow. "At least we got the supplies in time," Willow replied, trying to ignore the strange intimacy of being trapped in the small cabin with him. During previous storms, Xavier had slept in the barn, maintaining a respectful distance. Tonight, the blizzard made that impossible. "I can sleep by the stove," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I've slept in worse conditions." Willow nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I'll make up a pallet for you." They ate a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, the howling wind making conversation difficult. Afterward, Xavier took out his harmonica again, playing soft melodies that somehow made the storm seem less threatening. Willow found herself watching his hands as he played strong, capable hands that had worked tirelessly alongside hers for weeks now. Hands that had helped rebuild what she feared was lost. When he finished playing, the cabin felt suddenly quiet despite the storm's continued assault. Xavier looked up, catching her gaze, and something electric passed between them, a current of unspoken awareness that made Willow's breath catch. She stood abruptly. "I should turn in. Morning will come early, storm or no storm." Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Willow." In her small bedroom, Willow changed quickly in the cold, listening to the sounds of Xavier moving around in the main room. The knowledge of his presence just beyond her door was both comforting and unsettling. She slipped beneath the heavy quilts, shivering until her body heat slowly warmed the cold sheets. Outside, the storm continued its furious assault, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimney. And then, cutting through the storm's voice, she heard it Frank's whisper, so close it might have been spoken directly into her ear. "Be happy, Will." Willow sat up, heart pounding. "Frank," she whispered into the darkness. Only the storm answered, its voice rising to a shriek before subsiding again to a steady howl. Willow lay back down, pulling the quilts tighter around her shoulders. Grief and loneliness washed over her in equal measure, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. For months, she'd held herself together through sheer determination, refusing to give in to the despair that lurked at the edges of her consciousness. But tonight, with the storm isolating her from the world and Xavier's presence reminding her of what she'd lost, the dam finally broke. Willow buried her face in her pillow, muffling her sobs as years of pent-up emotion poured out of her. She cried for Frank, for the future they'd planned together, for the strength it took to face each day alone. She didn't hear her bedroom door open, didn't realize Xavier had entered until she felt the bed dip beneath his weight as he sat carefully on its edge. "Willow," he said softly. She stiffened, embarrassed to be caught in such vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she managed, wiping hastily at her tears. "The storm, don't apologize," Xavier interrupted gently. "Not for feeling." In the dim light filtering from the main room, his expression was one of understanding rather than pity. He made no move to touch her, simply offering his presence. "I still hear him sometimes," Willow confessed, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Frank, like he's trying to tell me something." Xavier was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then let my voice be softer tonight." The simple statement acknowledging her grief without diminishing it broke something open inside her. Fresh tears came, but different now, cleansing rather than devastating. "Would you like me to leave?" Xavier asked after a moment. Willow surprised herself by shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "Please stay, just stay." Xavier shifted, leaning his back against the headboard on top of the quilts, maintaining a respectful distance while offering comfort through his presence. Willow lay back down, suddenly exhausted. "When my father died," Xavier said softly, "I used to imagine conversations with him, things I wished I'd said, advice I needed but could no longer ask for." "Does it ever stop?" Willow asked, voice small in the darkness. "The pain changes," he replied thoughtfully. "Becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." He paused. "At least, that's what I've found." The honesty in his voice was a comfort in itself. Willow felt her tears subsiding, replaced by a curious calm. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes growing heavy, "for staying." "Always." Xavier replied, so quietly she wasn't sure she'd heard it. Willow drifted into sleep with the storm raging outside and Xavier's steady presence beside her, the first truly restful sleep she'd had since Frank's death. When she woke, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the frost-covered window. Xavier was gone, but the impression of his weight remained on the edge of the bed. For a moment, Willow wondered if she dreamed his presence, but then she caught sight of his harmonica on her bedside table, left there deliberately, a silent message of support. She dressed quickly and stepped into the main room to find Xavier already awake, stoking the fire. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Morning," he said. "Storms passed, but we got at least 2 feet of snow. Drifts are higher in some places." Willow nodded, uncertain how to navigate the new intimacy between them. "Thank you," she said finally, "for last night." Xavier's expression softened. No need for thanks. They settled into their morning routine, feeding animals, clearing paths through the snow, checking for damage from the storm. The work was harder in the deep snow, but they moved together with the efficiency of partners who had learned each other's rhythms. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had risen enough to start melting the snow from the roof edges. Willow and Xavier stood in the barnyard, surveying their work. "We should check the cattle tomorrow," Xavier suggested. "Make sure none got separated during the storm." Willow nodded agreement, then hesitated. "Xavier, about last night, you don't need to explain anything," he interrupted gently. "I know," she said, "but I want to." She took a deep breath. "After Frank died, everyone kept telling me what I should do. Sell the ranch, move to town, find another husband, as if I couldn't possibly manage on my own." Xavier listened silently, his eyes steady on hers. "I was so determined to prove them wrong that I didn't allow myself to grieve properly," Willow continued. "I thought if I showed any weakness, it would prove they were right, that a woman couldn't handle this life alone." "Grief isn't weakness," Xavier said quietly. "No," Willow agreed. "I see that now. But last night was the first time I've really allowed myself to feel it completely, and it was also the first time I felt like maybe." She hesitated, then finished, "Maybe I don't have to do everything alone." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a warmth that made his eyes more intensely blue. "You don't," he said simply. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then a distant gunshot broke the silence, causing both of them to turn toward the sound. "That came from the north pasture," Willow said, already moving toward the barn, "where we have the remaining cattle." They saddled their horses quickly and rode out, following the packed trail they'd created that morning. The snow made progress slow, but the horses were sure-footed, picking their way carefully through the drifts. As they crested the ridge overlooking the north pasture, Xavier held up his hand, signaling Willow to stop. Below them, 3 riders were driving a small group of cattle toward the property line. "Sullivan's men," Xavier said grimly, recognizing Hobbs among the riders. "Rustling your stock," anger flashed hot in Willow's chest. "They think the storm will hide their tracks." She pulled her rifle from its scabbard. "Not today." Xavier placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Wait, 3 against 2 aren't odds I like, especially when they're already armed and expecting trouble." "So we just let them take my cattle?" Willow demanded. "No," Xavier replied calmly. "We outthink them." He studied the terrain below, then pointed. "They're driving them toward Pine Creek. We can cut through Miller's Ridge and head them off at the Narrows." Willow considered this. Miller's Ridge was steep and potentially dangerous in the snow, but it would indeed allow them to intercept the rustlers before they could get the cattle off her property. "Let's go," she decided. They guided their horses carefully down the backside of the hill, out of sight of the rustlers. The path through Miller's Ridge was treacherous, a narrow trail between rocky outcroppings, now partially obscured by snow. Xavier led the way, his horse picking a careful path through the drifts. They emerged from the ridge just as the rustlers were approaching the narrow pass that served as the easiest exit from Willow's property. Xavier and Willow positioned themselves at the mouth of the pass, effectively blocking the only practical route. Hobbs and his men pulled up short, clearly surprised to find their escape route blocked. The cattle, confused by the sudden stop, milled around nervously. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Xavier called, his voice casual but his rifle ready across his saddle. "Seems you've gotten yourselves turned around." "These cattle belong to the Blackburn Ranch," Hobbs spat into the snow. "We're just moving strays back to Sullivan's property, must have wandered during the storm." "Funny how they all have my brand," Willow replied coldly. "And even funnier how you're driving them away from my ranch, not toward it." The two men with Hobbs exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't signed up for a confrontation, merely an easy theft during the confusion of the storm. "You're making a mistake, Thornton," Hobbs said, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Sullivan won't take kindly to interference." "And the territorial marshal won't take kindly to cattle rustling," Xavier countered. "Now, you gentlemen have two choices. You can turn those cattle around and drive them back to where you found them, or you can try your luck against our rifles." The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the cold air. Finally, one of Hobbs's companions, a young man barely out of his teens, broke the silence. "Come on, Hobbs, ain't worth dying over a few head of cattle." Hobbs's face twisted with anger, but he was no fool. 3 against 2 were good odds in a fair fight, but Xavier and Willow had the high ground and their rifles at the ready. "This isn't over," Hobbs growled, yanking his horse around. "Sullivan will hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Xavier replied evenly. "Make sure you tell him attempting to rustle cattle during a blizzard lacks imagination." "I expected better." They watched as Hobbs and his men grudgingly turned the cattle back toward Willow's pasture, following at a distance to ensure they returned all the animals they'd attempted to steal. "That was a risk," Willow said quietly to Xavier. "They could have opened fire." "Not with the position we had," Xavier replied. "Besides, men like that are cowards at heart. They only act when they think they have the advantage." Once the cattle were safely returned to the pasture, Hobbs and his men rode off, throwing dark glances over their shoulders as they departed. "They'll be back," Willow said grimly. "With more men next time," Xavier nodded. "Probably, but they'll be more cautious now and we'll be ready." The temperature dropped sharply as they rode back to the ranch, the setting sun painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. By the time they reached the barn, twilight had deepened to darkness, and the bitter cold of a mountain winter night had settled over the land. They tended to the horses in companionable silence, the routine of caring for the animals familiar and comforting after the tension of the confrontation. "We need to consider what happens next," Xavier said as they walked from the barn to the cabin. "Sullivan won't take today's humiliation lightly." "No," Willow agreed, stamping snow from her boots before entering the cabin. "But what can he do? He can't openly attack us without drawing unwanted attention from the territorial authorities." "He doesn't need to attack openly," Xavier replied, building up the fire that had burned low during their absence. "Men like Sullivan have more subtle ways of destroying their enemies." Inside the warm cabin, Willow hung her coat and removed her gloves, considering Xavier's words. "The loan," she said finally, "he'll call it due before I can possibly repay it." Xavier nodded grimly. "That would be my guess. Legal theft is always safer than the alternative." "Then we need a plan," Willow said, determination replacing the momentary despair. "A way to either repay the loan or get an extension until we can sell the cattle in spring." They spent the evening at the kitchen table, Willow's account books spread before them, searching for a solution. The numbers were unforgiving. Even with a successful cattle sale in the spring, they would barely break even on the ranch's operational costs. "What about this?" Xavier asked, pointing to an entry from the previous year. "Timber sales," Willow nodded. "The northeast section of the property has good pine. Frank sold some last winter to the sawmill in Helena. Good price, too. Could we do the same?" Xavier asked. "Cut timber through the winter, haul it to Helena when the pass is clear." Willow considered this. "Maybe. It's hard work and we'd need help for the cutting and hauling." "I know a few reliable men in town," Xavier said thoughtfully. "Men who aren't beholden to Sullivan and could use winter work." Hope, tentative but real, bloomed in Willow's chest. "It might work," she agreed. "We'd need to start soon, though, before the snow gets too deep." Xavier smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Then we have a plan, not a guarantee, but a fighting chance. Willow found herself smiling back, struck by how much had changed in the weeks since Xavier's arrival. The overwhelming despair that had been her constant companion had receded, replaced by a cautious optimism she hadn't thought possible. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on this place, on me." Xavier's expression grew serious. "You never gave up, Willow. You were fighting alone when most would have surrendered. I just joined the fight." The simple statement touched something deep within her. In a world where women were expected to depend on men for protection and provision, Xavier saw her as a partner in their shared struggle, not someone to be rescued. "Still," she insisted, "having you here has made all the difference." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "For me as well," he finally said, his voice low and sincere. "More than you know." The next 2 weeks were a flurry of activity as they implemented their timber plan. Xavier rode into town and returned with 3 men willing to work for a fair wage, and a share of the profits. Come spring, a former buffalo hunter named Caleb, a Swedish immigrant called Lars, and a quiet Shoshone man who went by the name Thomas. They set up a camp in the northeast corner of the property, close to the best stands of pine. Xavier and the men spent long days felling trees and stripping branches, while Willow kept the ranch running and brought supplies to the timber camp. The work was backbreaking, especially in the deepening cold of winter, but it gave them purpose and hope. Each massive pine that crashed to the forest floor represented another step toward saving the ranch. Sullivan, meanwhile, had grown ominously quiet. No more attempts at cattle rustling occurred, and his men kept their distance. The apparent reprieve made Willow more uneasy than outright conflict would have. "He's planning something," she confided to Xavier one evening as they sat by the fire, exhausted from another long day. "I can feel it." Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Probably, but whatever it is, we're stronger now than we were a month ago. We have allies, a plan, and progress toward paying off the loan." "Still," Willow persisted, "I can't shake the feeling that he's waiting for us to let our guard down." As if in response to her concerns, a knock came at the cabin door, startling both of them. Visitors were rare even in good weather and virtually unheard of after the heavy snows had made travel difficult. Xavier rose, hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "Stay back," he murmured to Willow, approaching the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called. "Pete from the store," came the muffled reply. "Got important news, Mrs. Blackburn. Let me in before I freeze solid." Xavier opened the door, revealing the storekeeper stamping snow from his boots on the porch. Pete's normally ruddy face was pale with cold and something that looked like worry. "Come in," Willow said, moving forward. "What brings you out in this weather, Pete?" The storekeeper entered, rubbing his gloved hands together as Xavier closed the door behind him. "News from town," Pete said, accepting the cup of coffee Willow quickly poured him. "Thought you should know right away." "What's happened?" Xavier asked, tension evident in his stance. Pete took a fortifying sip of coffee before answering. "Sullivan's called in all his loans, everyone in the county, giving folks 30 days to pay in full or forfeit their properties." Willow felt the blood drain from her face. "But that's impossible. No one can raise that kind of money in midwinter." "Exactly," Pete said grimly. "That's the point. He's not looking to be repaid, he's looking to acquire land. Word is he's made a deal with the railroad. They're planning a spur line through the territory, and Sullivan's promising right-of-way through properties he controls." Xavier and Willow exchanged alarmed glances. This was worse than they'd anticipated, not just a personal vendetta against Willow, but a systematic plan to seize control of the entire valley. "How many families are affected?" Xavier asked. "Dozen or more," Pete replied. "Most are like you, Mrs. Blackburn's small ranchers who took loans for improvements or to get through lean years." "And the 30-day deadline?" Willow asked, mind racing. "February 15th, Pete confirmed. Legal notices went out yesterday." Willow sank into a chair, the implications washing over her. Their timber plan might eventually raise enough to pay off her loan, but not within 30 days, not with the trees only partially cut, and no way to transport them to market until the spring thaw. There's more, Pete continued reluctantly. Sullivan's brought in additional men. Gun hands, not bankers. 6 of them arrived on yesterday's stage from Helena. Xavier's expression hardened. He's preparing for resistance, Pete nodded grimly. That's my read as well. These aren't lawmen, they're hired muscle. One of them I recognized from wanted posters a few years back. Bad business? After Pete left, promising to keep them informed of any new developments, Willow and Xavier sat in troubled silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickering shadows across the walls of the cabin that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. We need to warn the others, Willow said finally. The men at the timber camp and the other ranchers affected by Sullivan's deadline. Xavier nodded. I'll ride out at first light, but Willow, he hesitated, then continued, this changes things. Sullivan's bringing in gunmen means he's expecting a fight, maybe even hoping for one. What choice do we have? Willow asked, voice tight with frustration. I can't pay the loan in 30 days, neither can the others. If we don't stand together, we'll all lose everything. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled. There might be another way, he said finally. A legal challenge. The territorial courts might grant an extension if multiple landowners petition together, especially if there's evidence Sullivan is acting in bad faith. That would take time we don't have, Willow pointed out, and money for lawyers. True, Xavier acknowledged. But it would buy us time and it would be within the law. Willow studied him, hearing what he wasn't saying. You're worried about a violent confrontation. Xavier met her gaze directly. I've seen what happens when disputes over land turn bloody. No one wins, Willow. Even the survivors lose something they can never get back. The weight of his words settled between them, heavy with the knowledge of his past. Willow thought of Frank, of the gunshot that had ended his life and changed hers irrevocably. All right, she said finally. We try the legal route first. But I won't surrender this land, Xavier, not without a fight. I wouldn't expect you to, he replied softly, and you won't be fighting alone. The following days were a blur of activity as they implemented their two-pronged strategy. Continuing the timber harvest while organizing the affected ranchers to pursue legal action. Xavier rode from homestead to homestead, often through bitter cold and blowing snow, bringing news of Sullivan's plan and proposing a unified response. To Willow's surprise and relief, most of the ranchers agreed to join forces. Sullivan had underestimated the community's resilience and determination. By week's end, 12 families had pledged to support a legal challenge to the loan deadline. Willow rode to Helena herself, braving the treacherous mountain passes to consult with a lawyer recommended by one of the ranchers. The journey was grueling 2 days of travel through snow-choked trails, staying overnight in a crude-lined shack halfway to the territorial capital. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Reynolds, listened to Willow's account with focused attention. Sullivan's overreached, she concluded when Willow finished. Calling in all loans simultaneously without cause is a clear attempt to manipulate property values. The court should grant at least a temporary stay while the case is reviewed. How long would that take? Willow asked. Catherine's expression grew cautious. Hard to say. The territorial courts move slowly, especially in winter. Could be weeks, more likely months. We don't have months, Willow pointed out. Sullivan's deadline is less than 3 weeks away. I can file for an emergency injunction, Catherine replied. With 12 families affected, the judge might act quickly, but I need documentation, copies of all loan agreements, proof of regular payments, evidence of Sullivan's connection to the railroad. Willow nodded. I can get those. When would you need them? As soon as possible. I'll start drafting the petition today, but I can't file without the supporting documents. Willow left Helena with renewed purpose, making the arduous journey back to the ranch with plans already forming in her mind. Xavier met her at the cabin door, relief evident in his face when she arrived safely. The lawyer thinks we have a case, Willow told him, warming her frozen hands by the fire. "But we need documentation, lots of it, and quickly." Xavier nodded. "I've been thinking about that. Sullivan keeps all his loan records at the bank. We need access to those files." "Breaking into the bank would just give Sullivan more ammunition against us," Willow pointed out. "Not breaking in," Xavier corrected. "I know someone who works there, Mary Edgerton, the assistant clerk. She's no friend to Sullivan. He foreclosed on her brother's farm last year. She might be willing to help us." The plan took shape over the next few days. Mary Edgerton, approached discreetly by Xavier, agreed to copy key documents after hours. Meanwhile, the affected ranchers gathered their own loan paperwork and evidence of payments made. Sullivan, aware that something was brewing, increased patrols around his properties and the bank. His hired gunmen became a common sight in Clearwater, their presence an unsubtle threat to anyone considering resistance. 10 days before Sullivan's deadline, Mary managed to smuggle out copies of internal bank documents, including correspondence that confirmed Sullivan's deal with the railroad and his deliberate plan to force foreclosures. "This is exactly what we needed," Willow said, reviewing the papers with Xavier by lamplight. "Proof that he's acting in bad faith." Xavier nodded, expression grim. "It's strong evidence, but Sullivan won't take this lying down when he discovers what we've done." "Then we need to move quickly," Willow replied. "I'll ride to Helena tomorrow with these documents. Catherine can file the injunction petition immediately." "Not alone," Xavier said firmly. "The trails are dangerous and Sullivan's men are watching. I'm coming with you." Willow started to protest, then reconsidered. The stakes were too high to take unnecessary risks. "All right," she agreed. "We'll leave at first light." They packed quickly, preparing for another cold journey to Helena. Caleb and Lars agreed to watch over the ranch during their absence, rifles at the ready in case Sullivan tried to take advantage of their departure. The morning dawned clear but bitterly cold, the temperature well below freezing as they set out. They rode in silence, each lost in thought as their horses picked their way carefully along the snow-packed trail. They had just entered a narrow pass between towering rock formations when Xavier suddenly reined his horse to a stop, holding up his hand for silence. Willow froze, listening. At first she heard nothing but the soft breathing of their horses and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Then a faint sound of shifting gravel from above. Xavier's eyes met hers, a silent warning passing between them. Without speaking, he gestured for her to back her horse slowly toward a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter. The shot came just as they reached the relative safety of the rocks, a rifle crack that echoed through the pass as the bullet struck the snow where they had been moments before. "Ambush," Xavier said grimly, drawing his pistol. "Stay down." 2 more shots followed in quick succession, ricocheting off the rocks around them. Their horses shifted nervously, ears flattened in fear. "Can you see them?" Willow asked, her own rifle now in hand. Xavier peered carefully around the edge of the boulder. "At least 2 on the ridge to the north, probably more we can't see." "Sullivan's men." "Has to be," Xavier replied. "They knew we were coming this way." "Someone in town must have told them," Willow said, anger replacing her initial fear. "Betrayed us." Another shot struck closer, showering them with rock fragments. Xavier winced as a splinter grazed his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. "We can't stay here," he said, assessing their situation. "They have the high ground and time on their side. We need to move before they can surround us completely." Willow studied the terrain, looking for options. The pass continued ahead, winding between the rocky outcroppings, but attempting to ride through would make them perfect targets. Behind them lay open country for nearly a mile, no cover at all. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a narrow crevice in the cliff face about 50 yards ahead. "That gully leads up to the ridgeline. If we can reach it, we might be able to flank them." Xavier followed her gaze, nodding slowly. "It's our best chance. But one of us needs to provide covering fire while the other makes the run." "I'll go," Willow said immediately. "I'm lighter and faster." Xavier started to protest, then reconsidered. She was right, her slighter build would make the climb easier. "All right, when I start firing, run for the gully." Don't stop, don't look back, just go, Willow nodded, heart pounding as she prepared herself. Xavier positioned himself at the edge of the boulder, pistol ready. On my mark, he said quietly. 3, 2, 1, now. Xavier leaned out and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge where they'd spotted movement. Willow launched herself from behind the boulder, running in a zigzag pattern toward the gully entrance. Bullets kicked up snow around her feet, but she kept moving, focusing only on the dark opening in the rock face ahead. She reached the gully and dove inside just as a bullet struck the rock where her head had been moments before. The narrow passage offered protection from direct fire, though loose stones cascaded down as shots struck the cliff above. Willow began climbing immediately, using handholds in the rough rock to pull herself upward. The gully was steep but navigable, winding its way toward the ridgeline where the ambushers were positioned. Below, she could hear Xavier continuing to fire occasionally, keeping the attackers' attention divided. The sound drove her onward, even as her muscles protested the difficult climb. She reached the top of the ridge, gasping for breath, the cold air burning in her lungs. Cautiously, she peered over the edge. About 100 yards away, 2 men crouched behind a rocky outcropping, rifles trained on Xavier's position below. They hadn't noticed her approach, focused entirely on their target in the pass. Willow raised her rifle, steadying it against a boulder as she took careful aim. She had never shot a man before, but these men had tried to kill them, would still kill Xavier given the chance. Her finger tightened on the trigger. At the last moment, she adjusted her aim slightly and fired. The bullet struck the rock just inches from the nearest gunman's head, sending stone fragments flying. Both men ducked instinctively, then whirled toward the unexpected threat behind them. "Drop your weapons," Willow shouted, already shifting position to avoid return fire. "The next shot won't miss." The men exchanged glances, clearly surprised to find themselves suddenly outflanked. One started to raise his rifle, but Willow fired again, the bullet splintering the stock of his weapon. "That's your last warning," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. After a moment's hesitation, both men carefully laid down their rifles, raising their hands. "Now walk away," Willow ordered. "Back to town. Tell Sullivan you failed." The men backed away slowly, hands still raised, then turned and hurried down the far side of the ridge. Willow kept her rifle trained on them until they disappeared from sight, then signaled to Xavier in the pass below. When they reunited minutes later, Xavier's eyes held a new respect. "That was impressive marksmanship," he said, "and smart. Not killing them means less trouble with the law." "I've never killed anyone," Willow replied, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "I don't want to start now, even if they deserved it." Xavier nodded, understanding in his gaze. "We should keep moving. Those 2 will report back to Sullivan, and he'll send more men." They continued toward Helena with increased caution, taking less traveled trails and stopping frequently to check for pursuers. The ambush had delayed them significantly, and darkness was falling by the time they reached the outskirts of the territorial capital. Catherine Reynolds received them at her home, alarmed by their disheveled appearance and Xavier's blood-streaked face. "Sullivan's men ambushed us on the trail," Willow explained, handing over the precious documents they'd protected at such risk. "They're getting desperate." The lawyer examined the papers with growing excitement. "This is exactly what we needed," she confirmed. "Especially this correspondence about the railroad deal. I'll file for the emergency injunction first thing in the morning." "How soon can we expect a decision?" Xavier asked. Catherine's expression grew cautious. "Judge Pemberton is fair but deliberate. Could be a few days, even with the urgency of the situation." "Sullivan's deadline is in 8 days," Willow reminded her, "if the injunction doesn't come through before then." "I understand," Catherine assured her. "I'll emphasize the imminent threat to multiple families and businesses. The territorial governor has been concerned about bank overreach. This case might get priority attention." They spent an anxious night at a small hotel near the courthouse, both too wired from the day's events to sleep soundly. At dawn, they accompanied Catherine to the courthouse, watching as she filed the petition for emergency injunction with supporting documents. "Now we wait," she told them afterward. I've requested an immediate hearing. With luck, the judge will see us today or tomorrow." 2 tense days followed as they awaited the judge's decision. Willow paced the small hotel room, alternating between hope and despair. Xavier remained outwardly calm, but Willow could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the vigilance with which he watched the street below their window. "What if we lose?" Willow asked on the evening of the second day, voicing the fear that had been growing inside her. "What if the judge sides with Sullivan?" Xavier turned from the window to face her. "Then we fall back on the timber plan. We've already cut enough to make a significant payment might be enough to negotiate an extension. And if Sullivan refuses to negotiate," Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "Then we face that when it comes," he finally said, "together." The simple statement, "together," eased something inside Willow's chest. Whatever happened, she was no longer fighting alone. The realization brought both comfort and a new awareness of how much Xavier had come to mean to her in the months since his arrival. "Xavier," she began hesitantly, "when this is over, whatever happens with the ranch," a knock at the door interrupted her. They exchanged glances, instantly alert. Xavier moved to the side of the door, hand on his pistol, while Willow called out, "Who is it?" "Catherine Reynolds," came the reply. "I have news." Xavier opened the door to reveal the lawyer, her expression unreadable as she entered the room. "The judge has made his decision," she announced without preamble. Willow's heart sank at Catherine's tone. "He ruled against us." To her surprise, Catherine's serious expression broke into a smile. "Quite the opposite. Judge Pemberton not only granted the emergency injunction, he's ordered a full investigation into Sullivan's banking practices." Relief washed over Willow like a physical force, nearly buckling her knees. "So the foreclosures are stayed indefinitely," Catherine confirmed. "Sullivan cannot take action against any of the properties until the investigation is complete and the case is resolved. That could take months." Xavier let out a long breath. "That gives us time to complete the timber harvest and sell the cattle in spring." "Exactly," Catherine agreed. "And there's more." The judge was particularly troubled by the evidence of Sullivan's railroad deal. He's referred the matter to the territorial prosecutor for possible criminal charges. "Sullivan won't take this lying down," Xavier warned. "He has too much at stake." Catherine nodded grimly. "I've thought of that. The judge has authorized the territorial marshal to provide protection for the plaintiffs if needed. A deputy will ride back with you to Clearwater." "When can we leave?" Willow asked, eager now to return to the ranch and share the news with the other affected families. "First thing tomorrow," Catherine replied. "The official injunction papers will be ready by then. Every plaintiff will receive a copy to present if Sullivan or his men attempt to take action." They departed Helena the following morning, accompanied by Deputy Marshal Alan Becker, a taciturn, capable-looking man with a reputation for fairness and courage. The return journey was tense but uneventful, with no sign of Sullivan's ambushers on the trail. Word of their victory spread quickly through the community. By the time they reached the ranch, Caleb and Lars had already heard the news via riders from town. They greeted Willow and Xavier with congratulations and obvious relief. "Sullivan's men pulled out this morning," Caleb reported, "headed back to town looking like they'd sucked on lemons. The banker himself hasn't been seen," Lars added. "Word is he's holed up in his office, refusing visitors." Deputy Becker nodded in satisfaction. "He's likely consulting with his lawyers, trying to find a way around the injunction. Won't be easy. Judge Pemberton's reputation for thoroughness is well earned." That evening, neighbors gathered at Willow's cabin to celebrate their temporary victory and plan for the challenges ahead. The atmosphere was cautiously jubilant. They had won a reprieve, but the fight wasn't over. "We need to use this time wisely," Willow told the assembled ranchers. "Continue with the timber harvest, prepare cattle for spring sales, and look for ways to strengthen our financial positions. And watch our backs," Xavier added soberly. "Sullivan may be legally constrained, but that doesn't mean he's given up." Deputy Becker confirmed this assessment. "I'll be staying in Clearwater for at least a month, keeping an eye on things. The marshal has authorized me to deputize additional men if needed." As the gathering broke up, ranchers returning to their own properties with renewed determination, Willow found herself standing with Xavier on the cabin porch. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky above. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." "We wouldn't have gotten the injunction without you," Xavier shook his head slightly. "It was your courage that made this happen, Willow. You refused to give up when most would have sold out and moved on." "Not alone," she insisted. "I couldn't have done it alone." Xavier turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. "In Helena, you started to say something about what happens when this is over." Willow's heart quickened. She had almost forgotten that interrupted moment of vulnerability. "I did," she acknowledged. "I'd like to hear it now," Xavier said softly. "If you still want to tell me." Willow took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I wanted to ask what your plans are, if you'll stay even after the immediate danger has passed, or if you'll move on like you've always done before." Xavier was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "What would you want me to do?" "Stay," Willow said simply, the single word carrying all the emotion she'd been holding back for months. "I want you to stay." Something in Xavier's expression shifted, a softening, an opening that made him suddenly vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I've been running for so long," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place, but if there was ever a place and a person worth staying for." His voice trailed off, but his eyes never left hers. Willow stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cold night air. "Is that a yes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. When she remained where she was, he gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Yes," he said finally, "for as long as you want me here." The kiss that followed was gentle, at first tentative, exploring then deepening as months of unacknowledged feelings surfaced between them. Willow felt something unlock inside her chest, a space that had been frozen since Frank's death gradually thawing in the warmth of this new beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Willow asked, her hands still resting on his chest. "You were grieving," he said simply. "And I wasn't sure I had the right to offer you anything, given my past. And now," his smile was tender, "now I know some things are worth the risk." The weeks that followed brought both challenges and unexpected joys. Sullivan, thwarted in his immediate plans, retreated to Helena to fight the injunction through legal channels. His hired gunmen disappeared from Clearwater, though Deputy Becker remained vigilant, warning that the banker hadn't given up, merely changed tactics. The timber operation continued successfully, with logs stockpiled for transport to Helena when the spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Xavier's expertise proved invaluable, his years of varied experience translating into practical solutions for the myriad problems they encountered. And through it all, something new blossomed between Xavier and Willow, a partnership that transcended their work together. Growing into a deep bond neither had expected to find, they were careful, mindful of town gossip and the still fresh nature of Willow's widowhood. But in private moments, quiet evenings by the fire, shared laughter over meals, the brush of hands as they worked side by side, the connection between them strengthened and deepened. One evening in late March, with the first hints of spring softening the winter landscape, Xavier and Willow sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The air held the promise of renewal, the subtle scent of thawing earth rising around them. "Sullivan's appeal was denied," Xavier said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Got word from Catherine today. The investigation into his banking practices continues and the prosecutor is preparing charges related to the railroad deal." Willow nodded, relief washing through her. "So we're safe." "The ranch is safe as anything can be in this world," Xavier replied, his hand finding hers on the porch railing. "The timber sale should clear enough to make a substantial payment on the loan. Catherine thinks you can negotiate better terms with whoever takes over the bank after Sullivan." That's good news, Willow said softly. Then, after a pause, you said you, not we. Xavier looked at her, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. Force of habit, I suppose, still getting used to the idea of belonging somewhere. And do you? Willow asked, turning to face him fully. Belong here, Xavier stood, drawing her up with him. In the fading light, his expression was serious yet tender. I belong wherever you are, Willow Blackburn, if you'll have me. Is that a proposal, Xavier Thornton? Willow asked, her heart suddenly racing. It is, he confirmed, taking both her hands in his. Not very eloquent, I'm afraid. I've never done this before, Willow smiled, unexpected tears blurring her vision. It's perfect, she whispered. And yes, my answer is yes. They were married in early May, with apple blossoms scenting the air and new grass carpeting the ranch's rolling pastures. The ceremony was simple, held on the ridge overlooking the property they had fought so hard to save. Friends and neighbors gathered to witness their vows, the community that had stood together against Sullivan now celebrating this new beginning. Catherine Reynolds came from Helena for the occasion, bringing news that Sullivan had fled the territory ahead of his indictment, his financial empire crumbling in his absence. The bank had been placed in receivership, and negotiations for more favorable loan terms were proceeding well. As sunset painted the sky in colors to rival the previous autumn's glory, Xavier took out his harmonica and played a joyful tune that had guests clapping and stomping their feet. Willow watched him, her heart full to bursting with a happiness she had never expected to find again. Later, as the celebration continued around them, they stole a moment alone at the edge of the gathering. The first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the eastern sky, while the west still glowed with the last light of day. Happy? Xavier asked softly, his arm around her waist. More than I thought possible, Willow replied honestly. There were days I didn't think I'd keep the ranch, let alone find. She hesitated, then finished, find love again. Xavier's expression grew thoughtful. Do you still hear him, Frank? The question surprised her, but Willow considered it seriously. No, she said finally, not for a long time now. I think he said what he needed to say. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. Some ghosts are gentle in their leaving. They are, Willow agreed, leaning into his embrace. And some new beginnings are unexpected gifts. As darkness gathered around them and laughter floated from the celebration behind them, Xavier bent to kiss her a promise, a commitment, a future unfolding before them like the vast Montana sky. To unexpected gifts, then, he whispered against her lips, and the courage to accept them. 5 years later, Willow stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching Xavier teaching their 3-year-old son, Samuel, to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried across the spring green pasture, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the distant sound of men working on the new barn. The Thornton Ranch, as it was now known, had prospered beyond their most optimistic hopes. The cattle operation had expanded, the timber business had proven profitable, and their reputation for fair dealing had brought additional opportunities. 3 cowhands now worked for them year-round, with more hired during busy seasons. Sullivan had never returned to Montana territory, his schemes ultimately leading to his downfall. The bank had been restructured under new management, with policies that supported rather than exploited the community's hard-working ranchers and farmers. As Xavier lifted Samuel from the pony and set him on his shoulders, Willow placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the gentle movement of the child that would join their family by summer's end. The doctor suspected twins this time, a prospect that both thrilled and slightly terrified her. Xavier caught sight of her watching and waved, his smile visible even at a distance. He said something to Samuel, who waved enthusiastically, then they started toward the house, the small pony trailing behind them. Willow thought back to that snowy night years ago when a stranger had knocked on her door, offering help when she most needed it, but was least willing to accept it. How close she had come to turning him away, to facing her battles alone out of pride and fear. Instead, she had found not only a partner in saving her ranch, but a love she hadn't believed possible after loss had shattered her world. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, arguments, moments of doubt, but they had faced each challenge together, growing stronger with every obstacle overcome. As Xavier and Samuel approached, their faces alight with shared joy, Willow felt a sense of completeness that transcended mere happiness. This was where she belonged, where they all belonged on this land they had fought for, with the family they had built together. "Mama," Samuel called excitedly. "I rode all by myself." "I saw, sweetheart," Willow replied, opening her arms as Xavier set the boy down to run to her. "You were very brave, like Papa," Samuel declared proudly. "And like Mama," Xavier added, climbing the porch steps to join them. "The bravest woman in Montana territory." He leaned down to kiss her, his hand coming to rest gently on her belly beside hers. "How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," Willow said, and meant it. "Everything is perfect." And as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the land in the golden light of approaching evening, Willow Blackburn Thornton knew with absolute certainty that she had found her voice, her strength, and her home not in the whispers of the past, but in the loving presence that had taught her to listen to her heart again.